his presentation on real emissions from diesel cars and vans and how to solve urban air quality problems most effectively. So thank you very much for joining us today, Nick. Yes, you can change slides. Thank you very much.
Great. Thank you very much, and good morning, everyone. In a way, sort of it neatly follows on from that panel discussion. What I wanted to do is share the sort of latest findings from our work, which many of you know in terms of the real-world test programs that we run. We've got latest information on NOx and particles from the latest vehicles. Just to very quickly summarise where I see the current situation is that it is now clear that what I call genuinely clean diesels are now on the market. They are there. We would contend actually that they've been there, some have been there for some time. But now, with the first RDE cars on the road, it's absolutely categorically clear. But at the same time, and that is the inherent paradox in this whole situation, just at the moment that these vehicles are provably clean, is at the moment of maximum consumer confusion and, frankly, policymaker confusion in many places, which is leading, in pretty much every European country except Italy, I think, the sales of new diesel cars are falling because of a variety of uncertainties, particularly around urban access controls. In the UK and in a number of other countries, actually, the sales of used diesel vehicles is going up as the residual values have fallen somewhat. People are seeing bargains. And vehicles, they can. Well, many are holding on to their existing older diesels, but actually there's a healthy market in people buying these second-hand used diesels, which are on average significantly more emitting than the new one. And so what we're seeing at the moment, while the market has gone into some degree of paralysis, it's actually, as we stand still, I would argue that air quality and greenhouse gas emissions are potentially getting worse, and I'm going to share some data this morning to evidence that. Cities are taking various types of unilateral action originally around restrictions, but then you've got national governments coming in trying to impose some sort of standardisation. Otherwise, consumer confusion will go to complete consumer paralysis, potentially. And the growth of plug-in hybrids and various other forms of electrification, this is all a very important technology. It's very interesting. It should be judged in a technology-neutral way. I'm not going to dwell for a long time on it this morning, but there will never be the volumes of these vehicles in the market quickly enough to solve the urban air quality problems required on the time frame required. So just very quickly about us, and most of you probably by now will know us. We've been now testing for 7 years. Our operations since last year have expanded into South Korea as well, which has actually a very similar mixture of air quality problems to many European cities. We're entirely focused on PEMS testing, and our data is tests conducted by ourselves, so we can put it into a database and make that database available to a whole range of different players. One thing, we don't do regulatory certification testing. We know quite a bit about RDE and have followed it obviously extremely closely, but our test method is not strictly RDE compliant, but we do use RDE compliant equipment and the protocols around setup and calibration that would normally come with an RDE test. Just in terms of very brief metrics as to the milestones we've now passed, we've now done over 2,000 passenger vehicles worldwide. A smaller program of vans, and I completely agree with the comment earlier. Vans is a big under-researched area, has had a lot less focus than it should do. By and large, my rule of thumb is that the structure of the problem with vans is exactly the same as cars, but a bit worse, largely because of the payload differential. But it is a problem akin to passenger cars, not the success that there's been with the heavy goods vehicle regulation. In addition to that, we do heavy-duty agricultural equipment, a whole bunch of non-road mobile machinery, which is obviously, with Stage 5 coming, is a very relevant area, and even some stuff that floats. So we've done a barge going up and down the Thames to be able to compare, is it cheaper and less emitting to transport 500 tonnes of payload along the River Thames from one side of London to the other, or stick it on a large number of trucks and go around the M25? And it's thrown out some very interesting results. So move on. Right, so what is our data saying? I've updated this slide slightly since last year with the latest test data. What we have is essentially the date of registration of the vehicle on the horizontal and our real world, on our standardised test, the real world NOx emissions in grams per kilometre on the vertical axis. And just to recap what we were seeing previously is the growing spread over time. So grey, Euro 3 and 4, blue is Euro 5, orange is Euro 6. Very recently, the very worst ones that were on the market, the ones which are typically over 1,000 milligrams per kilometre of NOx, have now disappeared. They have now gone off sale. And you've now got an increasing number down the bottom of vehicles, some of which are Euro 6D cars, some of which actually are pre that, which are right down in the very low area and below the Euro 6 regulated level. But you still have many on sale which that are between 500 and 1,000 milligrams. It is true to say, and what the industry often says is that Euro 6 is on average cleaner than Euro 5 to the tune of about 51%. But that disguises this huge and growing variability. As you move through time, through the Euro stages, the spread from best to worst gets greater. I thought I'd put up a comparison to the US. So we've now been gathering a lot of NOx data in the US market on diesel vehicles. And this is how they compare to the average of the diesel vehicles we tested in the EU. So the first bar is the EU vehicles, and then the second bar is all the diesel vehicles we've tested in the US. So that's coming in at around 60 milligrams per kilometre. And that is actually a pretty heady mix of Ford F350s and other, fairly substantially sized vehicles. There are very few small diesel vehicles in that mix. And I have gone slightly controversially one step further. If we exclude the vehicles currently under investigation by the EPA, I make no comment one way or the other on the legality of it. So if you exclude those under investigation, you actually get down to an even lower figure of less than 30 milligrams per kilometre. These vehicles have been on the market for many years. So this is not a technology issue. This is a regulatory issue. But then back to Europe. And I've put the first chart in a slightly easier to see format to be able to see that our concern is the spread from best to worst of what is still on the market. So you've got the grey line down the middle is simply model year by model year, the mean NOx emissions on our test. The grey line is the mean of all the ones we tested in that year. The dark one at the top is the worst, and the best is the lighter blue at the bottom. And you'll see, yes, the worst are getting a bit less bad, but they still very much exist, and they're cars on sale today, certified to Euro 6. And they will be on sale potentially for some time to come, and also, even once they can't be sold new, they will be hanging around on the road for many, many, many years to come, 10 plus years. And that ultimately is the nature of the air quality problem that exists. Put another way, and you probably tell from my comments on the panel, I see this often very much from an economic point of view and the market malfunction that we have. I thought I'd just put this very simple sort of cascade chart just to try and encapsulate the progress that's been made, but still the problem that exists. So this is, again, the combined NOx emissions on our test. So you had, back in 2013, when the first Euro 6s were coming on the market, if you looked at the dirtiest 10% that we tested, emitted 1,777 milligrams per kilometre. The cleanest in 2013 were actually 265, much, much less than the dirtiest 10% last year. So it is, chronologically, it is, you had some very clean ones many, many years ago, and the dirtiest ones today are still much, much dirtier. But then you compare it to the average of the RDE vehicles that we've tested so far, and you get a massive contraction. Compare that to the average of gasolines. Actually, so the average of the RDE vehicles we've tested so far are similar to the average of all the gasolines we've tested. But then the cleanest 10% we've tested in 2017, and which are non-RDE vehicles, were even lower emitting still. And I put, finally, the very cleanest vehicle we've tested so far this year delivered 15 milligrams per kilometre. So that gives you a scale of the problem that's caused for good functioning of the market mechanism. I will just, as a sidebar, just re-emphasise that these aren't RDE compliant tests. There's many similarities, and I would flag probably the single biggest difference is that our test excludes cold start. So I fully flag that to you, that cold start is not included in this analysis. But to unravel this problem, I think it's about clarity and honesty by policymakers, really, about this situation. But otherwise, it'll just feed the consumer cynicism. If you try and fudge the issue and then someone finds that they have just bought something which is emitting 1,000 milligrams per kilometre, it's just going to feed back and reinforce that anti-diesel sentiment. Personally, I'm not a champion for one technology over the other. I just want the right information to be out there. Then to compare to gasoline, so in many policymakers' minds, okay, well, if diesel's dead, then right, let's all go back to petrol and it'll all be fine. I would challenge that simplistic notion. I don't think anyone in this room would probably hold that notion, but actually outside of this room, it's certainly the case. Now, from our tests, unsurprisingly, the real-world CO2 emissions from an average gasoline compared to diesel is about 18% higher. What we found in the early stages of the particle number testing that we're doing is that diesels have about 71% lower particle number emissions than the gasolines we've tested. Small sample sizes so far, but that's what the early evidence is suggesting. And as I showed on the previous slide, essentially the better diesels are now equivalent NOx emissions to the average of petrols. And you can see this in a way on this chart to the right. So what you've got is that the NOx emissions is the blue bar, particle number is the orange bar, and I've merged that onto the same left-hand scale. And then put CO2 on the right-hand scale, which is the grey line bar. But essentially what I'm showing you, the average Euro 6 gasoline is the first set, the average Euro 6 diesel is the second set. So essentially, one is better for NOx and the other is better for particle number. But if you then narrow it down to the cleanest 10% of diesels that we've tested so far, what you've got is that the particle number is less and the NOx is about the same. And the CO2 is 18% different, lower as well. So that starts putting a very different complexion on the situation and the anti-diesel narrative, and particularly what is the right policy. You do not want a policy where there is a very simplistic switch straight back to unhybridized gasoline. That may well make the air quality worse, which is the comment I made on my opening slide. There's many assumptions underlying that, of course, about mix effects, but that is the risk. But put another way, if we look at to exaggerate to make the point, if we look at the 10% dirtiest gasolines for NOx that we've tested, it's 129, compared to the cleanest 10% of diesels when this was done was running at 70 milligrams per kilometre. So actually, the cleanest diesels were half the NOx emissions of the dirtiest petrols. Dirtiest gasoline. So, what we think very much, individual model selection is the dominant factor now in coming to the right decision, right policy decision. I'd like also to, when we're coming to the questions of complete information and setting good policy, I wanted to look a little bit more about CO2 as well, because aggregate CO2 from passenger cars has for a constant level of road kilometres has fallen. But it has not fallen because for a like-for-like reduction in CO2, like-for-like being cars of similar sizes over time. If you correct for that, actually, whether it's diesel in the EU, gasoline in the EU, or gasoline in the United States, the real-world CO2 emissions has been about flat for years, despite what the NEDC figures suggest. Aggregate has fallen because of, firstly, downsizing of engines, and secondly, because of at the fleet level, the dieselisation of the mix. So I think, firstly, it's important to understand what that source of CO2 reductions is for setting good future policy. But also the second point is, if the diesel share goes into reverse, we can work out fairly mechanistically what the likely increases in CO2 emissions will be. And that's already being seen even through the NEDC figures. But I say that's absolutely what is risk to happen. So what we do, many of you will know already, we publish our data and make the data available free access. So we're trying to put that data out there to help consumers and others to resolve this problem. All available for free at equirindex.com. We have our air quality label, which is the NOx label, fuel economy, CO2, all from the same test, to which will be added a number of other indices that are coming along. Including, we're certainly working on how to express our particle number data in an index. That, as you will all know, there's the measurement challenges and the variability of particle number emissions is a much harder problem than the others, so we don't underrate that at all. We are using the RDE compliant equipment in doing our measurements, at least to give that point of consistency. But I would hope over time that it'll be a practical proposition to do a rating for that. And what could a policy proposal to actually solve this problem? So I've gone on about the problem. So what actually practically could you do to solve the problem? And I think ultimately, back to the earlier graph, conceptually it's actually very simple, which is you need to be able to differentiate. Irrespective of Euro stage, you have to be able to differentiate based on the real world emissions. By our modelling, actually, you wouldn't need, if we talk in terms of if we set a policy based on the EQA AQ rating for NOx, what actual rating level would you have to have, in our view, to actually make a significant improvement to urban air quality? And actually, what's striking is that we believe you would only need to set a rating of, a maximum rating of E. A maximum rating of D, so E and worse would be restricted in some form, which is the equivalent to setting that line at the Euro 4 level. So it wouldn't require setting it at the Euro 6 level or even the Euro 5 level. It's a measure of the degree to which vehicles are over the limit, that actually, if only you could get all diesels on the road to just meet Euro 4 in real-world operation, you would make a serious dent in the problem. And so doing a cut like that and essentially restricting those which are the high emissions sort of runs completely perpendicular to the current UK government's policy, which is essentially whacking up the tax on all diesels unless they're RDE stage 2, RDE step 2, which is, that in itself is not wrong, but it's not sufficient. So theirs is sort of a vertical cut on this at a date essentially far too far in the future to make a great deal of difference. So I think a vertical cut using some method based on real-world emissions is essential. It also, this way of thinking about things also helps put into context policies such as retrofits and scrappages. And our view is that it has to be judged at the individual pair-wise trade, if we're talking about scrappage, because you could trade in one of the very cleanest Euro 3s and 4s for one of the very dirtiest Euro 6s, and you could up to quintuple the real-world NOx emissions and spend taxpayers' money in doing so and heavily distort the marketplace. So a policy would have, people talk about targeted scrappage schemes. What a targeted scrappage scheme would have to be is one that proved that the trade reduced emissions. For this could also be used, to validate retrofits as well. Again, a retrofit is only any good if in real-world operation it delivers actual provable benefits when installed in a particular, on a particular model. I think as well, what we're doing so we're suggesting and making our data available and encouraging people to use it to try and help solve this problem. What we're doing also behind the scenes is a lot of what I call local actions as well. So we're talking with a number of agencies. We've been making good progress in the UK. There's a number of secondary actions that may happen in cities, not about access restrictions or charging, but other mechanisms around car parking and other mechanisms that could restrict vehicles that are very dirty in real-world operation. But fleet procurement actually is the single biggest one, whereby actually agencies are saying, actually, we've got to buy 1,000 vehicles for our fleet. We're going to set a minimum or a maximum real-world emissions level. Otherwise, you can't submit your car for tender. The largest one so far that we've done is through the Environment Agency in the UK, which is the government environment body, where they did a tender round for 2,000 vehicles last year and set vehicles had to meet at least an Equa D rating or cleaner, otherwise you were disqualified from the tender. And and in the end, the result of the tender was every vehicle brought on fleet was an Equa A rating. So in one cycle, over a large number of vehicles, that fleet was significantly cleaned up. And we're doing similar things with other governmental bodies. But I see this as something that could be relatively quickly and easily implemented across Europe. The Mayor of London publishes our AQ data on the Cleaner Vehicle Checker, which I hasten to add is not the basis of the charging in London, but it's a complement to try and inform and encourage consumers when updating their cars, which are the cleanest ones. So finally, then, so what does this all mean? And I think, and this is more my personal take on this based on the data, and I think diesels could endure actually for quite a lot longer because of their inherent advantages of the cleaner ones, but only if there's some method for discriminating to get those dirty ones out of the market and restore trust. But I do think, undoubtedly, there's already a strong transition towards various levels of hybridisation. That is going to continue, and that will be the thing which will lead to the next sort of step change or advantageous movement of the air quality CO2 trade-off. And then there will be, over time, deeper electrification, only because that is the only way to meet the CO2 targets in the long term. But by bringing a bit more of order and time to this transition, I think it gives the market more of a time to adjust. It minimises economic and social distribution effects, because in a way it gives people the time to change. When they were going to change their car anyway, they can do it at that time and then just make the right trade. And in a sense, if you do it like this, it puts an onus, and I put it slightly cheaply, I suppose, but in a way, it would be good if the onus was put back on the OEMs who produce these very highest emitting cars. If in some way they were involved in the remediation of those diesels and either helping getting them off the road more quickly or retrofitting them or doing whatever. Actually, because there is such a diversity from the worst to the best, in a way it would be quite, perhaps it sounds a bit soppy, but the fairest outcome might be actually that, those manufacturers of the dirtiest ones do something to remediate those vehicles, and this may be a sensible mechanism to do it. And to help this all along, I co-founded with Massimo Allow Independent Road Testing Air, which is a not-for-profit campaigning group to try and bring this sort of data, Equa data, but other data as well, to bring to bear on this problem, to try and solve it in the most, the quickest, most pragmatic and lowest cost way. So, on that note, 22 seconds over. Sorry, I'll stop there. But thank you very much for listening. I'm very happy to take any questions.